This lecture will dive into the theories of justice that Beecham and Childress outline. This presentation is divided into two parts. So the first part is going to look at the traditional theories of justice, utilitarian, libertarian, egalitarian, and communitarian frameworks. And then we'll look at more recent theories of justice that Beecham and Childress discussed, the capabilities theories and well-being theories. Let's begin with the utilitarian framework, and hopefully you know what to expect since we talked about utilitarianism in the past. So utilitarianism was based on the idea that we should always try to maximize the benefit for the most involved. And so it's no surprise that the material principle of distributive justice echoes that sentiment. So the idea for utilitarian framework of justice is to each person according to rules and actions that maximize social utility. Here on the right-hand side, I've got this example that I'm going to use in the next three slides as well with all these traditional theories of justice. So imagine that there's a case where there is a limited supply of medicine, there's a higher demand than there is a supply, so how are we going to distribute fairly? Just a reminder, these theories of justice are theories of justice about distributive justice. Hopefully you remember from the previous lecture that distributive justice is all about the fair distribution of resources. And so a utilitarian might respond to this case by saying distribute the medicine so that none of it goes to waste. This is going to be rooted in the principle of utility, which is to seek the highest net benefit that we can, or the one with the least disvalue if there's only undesirable results that we can achieve. And so the utilitarian framework is challenged in a couple ways, though, as Beecham and Childress note. So utilitarian, with a practical account of justice, must explain how welfare is to be understood and how to weight conditions of welfare in the system. So it's the same critique that we had of utilitarianism in the previous week, where it's great that we are going to do this utilitarian calculus, but we have to figure out how the numbers and how the values are being derived, and that is no easy feat. Human rights and principles of obligations have no other basis than the utility maximization under a theory of or utilitarian theory of justice. And just as conditions of social utility can change, so the range of protected rights can also change. Now let's turn to a libertarian theory of justice. So the libertarian theory emphasizes individual rights to social and economic liberty, while also invoking these fair procedures as their ultimate basis for justice, rather than any substantive outcomes such as an increase to welfare. So the material principle of distributive justice looks something like this: to each person a maximum of liberty and property resulting from the exercise of liberty, rights, and participation in free market exchanges. And so the emphasis here is on fair procedures rather than substantive outcomes, like I was just saying. And if we look at the case of the medicine, so a libertarian might respond, distribute the medicine to those that are willing to purchase it on the free market. That has two aspects here. So the first one is willingness. The medicine is not necessarily something that the public would have to take. It's up to them if they want to take it. That's the maximum liberty part. And then how is it accessed? Well, it's accessed through the free market. Now, Beecham and Childress cite Robert Nozick as one of the most prominent libertarian theorists. And Nozick has these three principles of justice. So justice in acquisition, justice in transfer, and justice in rectification. And for him, there's no pattern of just distribution that exists independent of the free market procedures of acquiring property legitimately, transferring that property, and providing rectification for those whose property was illegitimately taken or who otherwise were illegitimately obstructed in the free market. Now, I really like this next paragraph that Beecham and Childress have, because ultimately how they're going to set up their account of justice isn't to say we necessarily have to subscribe to a single theory of justice. They're more pluralistic at the end. And all these theories aren't necessarily in conflict with one another on what they prescribe. So here in the text, they say libertarians do not oppose utilitarian or egalitarian patterns of distribution if these patterns are freely chosen by all participants affected. So there again is this idea of maximum liberty. People are freely choosing this. It's not thrust upon them. Any distribution of goods, including public health measures and health care, is just and justified if and only if individuals in the relevant community freely choose it. Continuing, the state must not coercively take anyone's personal property to benefit another, but it can justifiably restrict by coercive means those who violate the liberty rights of others. So that's the basis of a libertarian theory of justice, is this idea of maximum liberty. People get to freely choose what happens to them, and the way in which we are, the emphasis is on the procedure of making sure that people's access and protection of their property is upheld. And Beecham and Childress sort of finished by saying that in this system, this libertarian system, investors in healthcare have property rights, physicians have liberty rights, and society is not morally obligated to provide healthcare. So libertarian theories are typically pitted against egalitarian ones. An egalitarian theory of justice is based on this notion of equal access to the goods in life that every rational person values. So think water, food, shelter, often invoking material criteria of need and equality. So in the previous lecture, we talked about the principle of need as a basis for making decisions about distributive justice. And here we're just seeing that repeated. So this leads to the material principle for egalitarian theories, which is to each person an equal measure of liberty and access to the goods in life that every rational person values. Looking at our example on the right-hand side, right, the idea is that everyone should be able to access this medicine. It shouldn't just be for those who can or have the purchasing power on the free market to buy it. And so this principle of need can play a pretty integral role insofar as not everybody will need the medicine to the same degree. So how do we deliver it, or how do we distribute it? Well, we distribute it based on what people, or the amount of need insofar as people with equal access can actually meet those needs. Hopefully that made sense. That was a little bit jumbled. I apologize. But I think it's important to stress here, when you hear egalitarianism, you hear this whole idea of equal access. Remember, it's equal access, not that everybody gets equal amounts. It's not always equal distribution. Just make sure you don't read into it that type of just everybody gets the same thing. As Beecham and Childress say, no prominent egalitarian theory has contained a distributive principle that requires equal sharing of all social benefits to all persons. Instead, dominant egalitarian theories are qualified ones that identify basic equalities while permitting some inequalities. And Rawls's theory of justice is one such case. So hopefully you remember our discussion of Rawls, but if you don't, here's a quick recap. So the idea is that there are these two principles of justice that any impartial person would agree on. The first one is the equal liberty principle, which is this idea of maximum amount of basic liberty. That can be expanded to mean each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. So there is no sense in which one group has access and another one doesn't. Again, this is access, a right to access these things, not necessarily that everybody gets all of the same stuff. So the second principle here is divided into two. The first one is the difference principle. So to the greatest benefit of the least advantage, that's the only situation in which inequalities are permitted. And then the other side of this is the fair opportunity rule, insofar as that social and economic inequalities exist. They should be attached to these offices and positions that are open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity, meaning that anybody of any social and economic standing are able to access these positions. Those are the two principles that Rawls thinks an impartial person would agree on. And in the healthcare setting, healthcare is needed to achieve, maintain, restore adequate or species typical levels of functioning so that individuals can realize basic goals. That's one of the fundamental driving forces of egalitarian thinking in bioethics, which is also why the other two recent theories of justice that we'll talk about in the second part of this lecture are egalitarian. They're not necessarily Rawlsian, but egalitarian theories are quite popular, and just to reiterate, they're usually pitted against libertarian ones. The last traditional theory of justice is communitarianism. The material principle for communitarianism is rooted in this idea that we derive whatever the fair distribution is from conceptions of the good that are developed within a moral community. So Beecham and Childress mention how this is ultimately pluralistic because we exist within many different moral communities simultaneously. Think about nested situations in which, say, you live in a particular city. Within that city, you live in a particular neighborhood. Within that neighborhood, you might live in an apartment complex, and within that apartment complex, you live with your family. And so all of those different nestings, those each represent a moral community, and moral communities can overlap. So the conception of the good is ultimately as diverse as the moral communities themselves. And so if we were to look at our case of the medicine getting distributed, the idea is that the medicine should get distributed in whatever way best serves the community. So even if it doesn't serve me, the individual, in the best way, I should still uphold the idea that it should be distributed in the way that ultimately benefits the others around me first, not just myself. Beecham and Childress talk about or mention Aristotle and Hegel as cases of communitarian theories, but I really like the insertion of the Charles Taylor position. So he argues, or he claims, that the priority of individual rights over communal decision making are premised on a conception of the human good, example of being like the good of autonomous moral agency, as if individuals are isolated atoms existing independently of communities. Even the type of autonomy suggested by individualism cannot be developed in the absence of the family and other community structures and interests. So that's Taylor pretty much saying that we don't really have any individuality outside of the context of the social communities that we participate in. And so that seems to show a priority to the community itself, because our individual identity is largely shaped by the community that we participate in. So if you're thinking that seems radical to put the community before the individual, or have that expectation of self-sacrifice maybe in a lot of different ways, that is sort of the justification here of that the individual only is meaningful within the community. Beecham and Childress also briefly mentioned this organ donation rights case, which is pretty interesting. So the idea is that, when you pass away, you can donate your organs. And we've talked about it before with either the opt-in, opt-out model. A communitarian model would require an opt-out approach, because your death and harvesting organs from it can help the rest of the community. That seems to be your obligation, is to support the other members of the community who can benefit from the situation. I don't want to say benefit from your death, but that's essentially what's going on. But the idea here is that you have a specific responsibility to the community, and unless you explicitly state that you don't want to do it, the tacit understanding is that you would participate in it. So with communitarian theories, the idea is that the community is prioritized over the individual, but don't make that sound as scary as it is. The justification for that is that the individual only makes sense within the context of the community. look at the two recent theories of justice that Beecham and Childress outline. As I mentioned previously, both of these theories are going to be egalitarian. They're responses to Rawls's egalitarianism, but they're not necessarily Rawlsian. But they're also heavily influenced by Aristotelian moral theory. Hopefully you remember when we were discussing virtue ethics before that the highest good for Aristotle is this human flourishing. That's sort of at the core of these next two theories. First, we'll look at a capability theory, particularly Nussbaum's. But a capabilities theory rests on this idea that everybody should have the means necessary to exercise the capabilities that are considered essential for a flourishing life. So there is the Aristotelian idea of flourishing. The quality of persons' lives is contingent on what they're actually able to achieve. And a life well lived is one in which individuals sustain and exercise a group of these core capabilities, which you see on the right-hand side. This is a list of Nussbaum's 10 capabilities. Also, Sen is a very prominent capabilities theorist. We don't really see his theory develop much here, but that's another source if you're interested. The idea motivating Nussbaum's list is that there's a minimal level of social justice that requires the availability to all citizens these core capabilities. And I just listed them here. They're obviously in the text. I'll pick a couple of them if you want to read all of them. So looking at the first one, life, being able to live a normal life without dying prematurely or existing in a reduced state, making life not worth living. If we look a little bit further down, emotions, being able to have emotional attachments to things and people so that one can love, grieve, and feel gratitude without having one's emotional development blunted by fear, anxiety, and the like. Affiliation, being able to live meaningfully in the company of others with respect or without undue humiliation. And then play, being able to play and enjoy recreational activities. So that's just a sampling of what is in there. Obviously, you can look at it in the text for yourself. But the idea, hopefully, you can get from this list is that everybody should be able to do or accomplish certain things in life. And if there are these restrictions that keep people from having these capabilities to enjoy life to a certain degree, it seems as though we have a responsibility to remedy that issue. So for Nussbaum, these capabilities, which are essential to flourishing, must be socially sustained and protected. And the idea is that justice requires that we as a society ensure that the world does not interfere with individuals' development of these core capabilities or block political participation in any way that would stunt or harm these capabilities. It also focuses on putting persons in circumstances or conditions in which they're enabled to set their own goals and live as they choose. It's ultimately a very demanding theory of justice, especially if we make it a global theory, so extending it to world citizens. But I think that there is something intuitively appealing to this theory because at the end of the day, we all think that we should have an equal opportunity to pursue certain things in life, and if those things are restricted, we feel like we are being cheated in one way or another. The one problem with this theory, obviously, is how are we going to define the satisfaction of these different capabilities? They're going to look different in different circumstances, so it, again, very demanding theory of justice. But it's a really interesting one within the healthcare sphere. Right, we're trying to improve a patient's quality of life, and it seems like these capabilities are a good indication of ways in which we should ensure a quality of life standard. The second set of theories are well-being theories. So the material principle for a well-being theory is to each person the means necessary for the realization of core dimensions of well-being. Here on the right-hand side, you can see the 6 core dimensions of well-being that are developed by Madison Powers and Ruth Faden. You'll find the list on page 261 if you have the 7th edition, like me. So this sounds pretty similar to the capabilities theory, which is what Beecham and Childress sort of start off this section by saying. But the difference here is that well-being theories focus on states of being, like the well-being itself. And so it's about ensuring that people have this type of experiential state. So the idea of justice in or under these types of theories is to secure a sufficient level of each dimension for each person, mainly because an absence of any one of these conditions can be seriously destructive to health. So the well-being theories, again, is sort of similar to the capabilities theory insofar as that we're trying to ensure that people have, or I guess check all these different boxes, but the difference being, instead of with the capabilities theory, ensuring that people have the ability to pursue certain ends, here we're talking about states of well-being that people will experience for themselves. So this was sort of a crash course on different theories of justice. It's not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination, but hopefully you got a good idea of what is meant whenever you see these different terms pop up. So our traditional theories of justice and recent theories of justice, I just sort of listed the highlight phrase that distinguishes it from the other theories. So utilitarian approach is all about maximizing public utility. Libertarian, liberty, rights, and free or fair free market exchanges. Egalitarians, they're all about equal measure of liberty and equal access. Communitarians are deriving their concept of the good as it's developed within moral communities. So it's the community over the individual. And then with our two recent theories of justice, capabilities theory is all about the sort of ensuring that patients possess the capabilities that will allow them to seek to promote a flourishing life. And then well-being theories are realizations of these different core dimensions of well-being.